Now, I said that there have been three major continent-wide epidemics in Westeros since the Targaryen conquest. The first was the Shivers, which came 60 years after it. The second was the Winter Fever, which came about 130 years after the conquest, a year after the Dance of the Dragons ended, the devastating civil war between two rival factions of House Targaryen. So 130 years after conquest, still about 170 years before the War of the Five Kings. The winter fever wasn't quite as widespread as the shivers, but it hit Westeros in the devastating aftermath of a civil war and in the middle of a 6-year-long winter that they hadn't prepared for because everyone was too busy fighting. So they were in a much worse condition to deal with it relative to the shivers, which had happened, which was objectively worse, but it happened during a long period of peace. Now, we had heard of the winter fever briefly in the World of Ice and Fire sourcebook, which came out in 2014, but when Fire and Blood came out in 2018, it gave us more details that cleared up some misconceptions we had had about it. Because all we had to go on were some brief mentions in the World Book that, oh, well, it spread in the aftermath of the Dance of the Dragons. So I had assumed it was spread by different armies moving around Westeros, but Fire and Blood makes it clear that it started and spread primarily in the ports, in the port cities. It didn't get that far inland. The reason I thought it had been spread by armies is that historically, armies have always been a major vector for spreading disease. Even as late as the American Civil War, more men died from disease in their army camps than combat. And then we have the example of the so-called Spanish flu epidemic in 1918, which you've probably been hearing about lately. In the aftermath of the First World War, there was a massive global influenza epidemic, killed well over 20 million people at the very least. Huge international crisis. Well, you'd assume it's called the Spanish flu because it started in Spain, right? Wrong. Near as epidemiologists can discern, this really bad influenza strain spread around between all the cramped military hospitals on the Western Front in France. They're not sure where this specific DNA strain ultimately originated globally. It could have been farther in Asia, some say North America. But the first big outbreak point they later figured out must have been military hospitals along the Western Front, northern France. So why is it called the Spanish flu? Well, wartime governments in England, France, Germany didn't want to panic their people even more by admitting a giant influenza outbreak was underway, so they suppressed the media from reporting about it. All except for Spain, which was neutral in the First World War, so they had no press restrictions, and thus the first open reports about this big new influenza epidemic came out of Spain, so at the time everyone nicknamed it the Spanish flu. But retroactively they realized, no, that's where we first heard about it. It had started earlier than that in the Western Front. By the way, the 2009 swine flu epidemic was the same type of virus as Spanish flu, H1N1. Broadly the same type, but it was a different strain of H1N1. So for a time I thought, oh, it must have been spread by armies. It wasn't. That there are campaign zones in the Reach or the Riverlands where armies are moving all over the place that were not heavily affected by the winter fever. It was mostly spreading across the ports. It's just a cruel twist of fate that another apparently foreign disease epidemic started spreading in Westeros's ports in the aftermath of a big civil war. Maybe combined with famine conditions that lowered everyone's immune system, but it just had to happen then. But Fire and Blood makes it clear, though, that it started in the ports and it was mostly limited to ports. It didn't spread that far inland from the coast, something about the climate it needed to thrive in. Whereas the Shivers had started in Blackwater Bay, came from Dragonstone, and a day later was in King's Landing. It must have come in through ships. in Blackwater Bay, the winter fever started further north. The first place struck were the ports of the Three Sisters, the islands off the north coast of the Vale. They're in this bay called the Bight, between the Vale and the north. Uh, Soon it spread from the Three Sisters to White Harbor, the only city in the north. And once again, there was a wave of xenophobia, as these northern ports, they don't get so many merchants from the free cities. There aren't a lot of merchants from Volantis and White Harbor or the Three Sisters, so much as most of the foreign visitors to their ports are whaling ships from Ib Island, which is a large island nation north of the Dothraki, north of Essos. So everyone there started saying, the foreign Ibonese whalers must have brought the winter fever here, and of course they slaughtered every Ibonese they could find in the port. Though that didn't change anything, it didn't do them any good, it did nothing to stop the spread. The Ibonese, who knows if they brought it there or not. It said the Maesters never conclusively figured out, was this a disease that started in the forests of Ib Island that they brought here? Even, wiser heads, men of medicine, said, we never confirmed that. That was just ignorance and xenophobia of let's blame the foreigners. So it started in the Three Sisters, killed half of Sisterton, spread to nearby White Harbor, and then you could see on a map it was progressively moving south down the coasts from port to port, carried by ships, one after another. First it came from White Harbor to Gulltown, the only city in the Vale, and then to Maidenpool and Duskendale, and it is mentioned it even then started spreading to nearby Bravos, because Bravos is around where Gulltown is as you go south, before finally reaching King's Landing. Now here, something crucial happened with the winter fever. The hand of the king at the time was Tyland Lannister, a major character in Fire and Blood, and as soon as he heard that a new epidemic was spreading in the city, he instantly ordered that the city be quarantined. Once he heard that there's a disease spreading, it's another epidemic, he said, close all the city gates. No one is allowed to leave or enter. He was already in King's Landing. His goal was to keep it from spreading to the rest of Westeros, trapping himself in a plague city. And he was holed up in the Red Keep, but it didn't work. Eventually, he was one of the last people to die from the plague. But ultimately, this quarantine worked for the winter fever. Unlike the shivers, it doesn't seem that it ever spread beyond the east coast of Westeros. Fire and Blood contains no mention of it striking the major cities of the west coast, Old Town, Lannisport, the way the shivers did. On top of this, the winter fever they mention it never spread that far inland in the south, so we hear no mention of it in the Riverlands. Like, the shivers killed the head of House Tully at Riverrun. There's no mention of it striking the interior at Highgarden or Riverrun, far away from the coasts. The one exception, though, that there's an exception to this rule if it only hit the eastern ports, is that, as with some but not all real-life diseases, the winter fever was one of those kinds of diseases where it was more potent in colder climates and less so in warmer ones. So the north was the one region in which it passed beyond the ports and became widespread all over the place, all over the countryside. That everywhere else it was limited to port cities, you could quarantine them pretty well. All of the north, it spread across, and it was a lot more deadly there. It had a higher death rate. So the quarantine of King's Landing started on, it said, the third day of the year 133 after conquest, and the quarantine lasted about half a year. That by that point, the plague had pretty much run its course, but even in King's Landing, but even as it was tapering off in King's Landing, they were getting new reports that in the north it was continuing to spread, that it was even spreading inland, where it struck Barrowton. Fire and Blood and World of Ice and Fire explain this, that in terms of population centers, the north doesn't really have that many big ones. There's one actual settlement large enough to be called a city at White Harbor. It states below that, there's only 2 settlements big enough to be classified as a town. Just 2, Barrowton and the Winter Town outside of Winterfell. So other than those 3 things, there's not much in the north. They keep emphasizing that. It's the biggest kingdom, but it's largely empty. So despite not being a tight population cluster, where normally diseases hit King's Landing really hard, it's heavily populated, despite not being a tight population cluster, the north ended up getting hit worst of all by the winter fever. While in the south, it was mostly limited to the ports on the east coast. It spread all over the north, large sections of the interior, and it says in Fire and Blood, large sections of the north descended into anarchy for a time. They were so destabilized by the winter fever in a way that didn't happen in the south. The wildlings, of course, then took advantage of this weakness, and a war chieftain called Silas the Grim led an army of 3,000 wildling raiders south of the wall. I don't think he was a full king beyond the wall, he just had 3,000 raiders, but this might not seem like a huge army compared to Mance Raider had 100,000. But it didn't need to be that large. When you have your forces this limited, this decimated, that on the one hand, no big battles or campaigns of the Dance of the Dragons happened in the north, but their armies had marched south and lost a lot of men, the Winter Wolves. And then the winter fever on top of that killed so many people that after the winter fever hit, there simply weren't that many healthy warriors left to maintain order in areas that were falling into brigandage and anarchy from the plague. Much less on top, they were already having trouble maintaining order, and then there was a new wildling invasion they couldn't handle easily. So, how many able-bodied men were left by that point to fight off 3,000 wildlings? So, it mentioned this in just a quick paragraph, but this is part of the narrative. It'll be expanded on. That Cregan Stark, Lord Cregan Stark, was the head of House Stark during the Dance of the Dragons. He's a major character in Fire and Blood, and he will be a major character in House of the Dragon. It's said that he survives the war, but then he had to go back north, and he couldn't stay in King's Landing because he had to go and restore order there. He had to rally what few remaining men he could. He came back, rallied with a few remaining healthy men from like House Stark, House Glover, and the Night's Watch to try and restore order and defeat this wildling invasion with just whatever few remaining men he could scrape up. But that's a whole other story unto itself. It'll be a whole plot line that'll last like a full TV season. What the Starks were doing in the aftermath of the Dance of the Dragons. There's this whole localized plague storyline that it really hits the north harder than it does the south. No, I don't want to downplay it, though. It wasn't as widespread as the shivers across all of Westeros, but one of the places the winter fever did hit was King's Landing, where a lot of the major characters in the narrative are always concentrated. It's the capital city. So the winter fever is still a really big event in Fire and Blood with a lot of long-term consequences. Even so, why didn't it spread to other port cities in the south? Old Town and Lannisport. Even if it seemed to be worse in a wet coastal climate and not penetrate that far inland, in the south, it should have hit the major port cities of the west coast. It didn't. Old Town and Lannisport were spared. So, and you could see its progression on a map. It went Old Town, Maidenpool, Duskendale. You could draw an arrow. Why did it halt at King's Landing? Well, clearly because Tywin Lannister was smart enough and objective enough to quarantine a city he was in, rather than let it spread throughout the realm. Because of his decisive action, it never spread west to his home and family in Lannisport and Casterly Rock. Now, this raises an interesting question. Why doesn't Fire and Blood present any mention of attempts to quarantine the earlier outbreak of the shivers? It doesn't. There's no mention of quarantines or barring the gates to cities in any parts of Westeros. But suddenly there was this decisive quarantine that one of the major Lannister characters does at King's Landing, which saves half the realm. Well, I'm going to talk about that and other quarantines in the third and final big epidemic to hit Westeros, the Great Spring Sickness, which struck in the year 209 after conquest, which is about 90 years before the War of the Five Kings, which occurs during the prequel novellas called The Tales of Dunkenegg. However, I don't want this video to run too long and be unwieldy, so I'm going to talk about the Great Spring Sickness, the last of the three epidemics, and then bring up my analysis of I think this is why such and such patterns happened. In a second video after this, I'm going to split off, but conceptually, these are all one big video.